All right, let's dive right in. We got a big one on our plate today. The Kenyan Employment Act of 2007.
Yes, quite a bit to unpack here. Chapter 226, straight from the laws of Kenya.
Looks like someone's got some homework. But don't worry, we'll break it down together. So first things first, who does this actually apply to?
Well, this act covers a huge chunk of employees in Kenya, almost everyone,
Well,
really.
what's everyone? So who are the exceptions?
Right, good catch. It doesn't apply to the armed forces, the police, the prison service,
Makes sense.
the National Youth Service, and there are a few very specific scenarios involving family businesses that are also exempt.
Interesting. So for the vast majority of Kenyan workers, this act is the baseline, right?
You got it. Think of it as setting those minimum standards. Like, this is the least you can expect in terms of your rights and protections as an employee.
Okay, minimum standards, got it. But what if a contract, like an individual contract or maybe a collective bargaining agreement, offers something better?
Great question. In those cases, the more generous terms always win out.
Makes sense. So it's like having your bases covered no matter what.
Exactly. Now, speaking of having your bases covered, there's actually a pretty interesting provision in this act that I think highlights that protective spirit.
Oh, I'm intrigued. Lay it on me.
Okay, so imagine this. You're looking for a job, right? And someone says, hey, I can get you that job, but it'll cost you.
Like they're asking for money up front.
Exactly.
Wow, isn't that like a pretty standard thing to watch out for?
You'd think so, right? But in Kenya, they actually made it illegal.
No way.
Yeah.
Really?
Section 17.4 specifically prohibits employers from asking for any kind of payment in exchange for a job offer.
That's incredible. It makes you wonder what the situation was like before they put that in place.
It's a good reminder that these laws are usually a response to something real, you know?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And it's probably safe to assume that similar protections exist in other countries too.
Oh, absolutely. Preventing that kind of exploitation in the job market is a pretty universal goal, I'd say.
It's like a basic human decency thing, right? Okay, so we've talked about protecting people from shady hiring practices, but what about something even more vulnerable? Like, how does the Kenyan system handle the issue of child labor?
That's a really important question, and the Act actually takes a very strong stance on it.
I bet. No one wants to see kids being exploited.
Right, and we're not just talking about preventing kids from working long hours, although that's obviously part of it. Sections 53 through 55 of the Act deal specifically with what they call the worst forms of child labor.
Okay, so we're talking about the really serious stuff here. What does that actually look like in practice?
Think of things like forcing children into dangerous work environments, like mines or quarries, or situations where they're exposed to hazardous materials. The Act empowers officials to step in and literally cancel contracts that involve this kind of exploitation.
Wow, so it's not messing around. They've got real teeth to enforce this.
So we've seen how the Act aims to protect those seeking employment and those who are most vulnerable. But what about those who fall somewhere in between, those who are working on a casual or temporary basis? How does the Kenyan system view that kind of employment?
Yeah, that's a really important point to bring up because a lot of people, especially when they're just starting out in the workforce, they find themselves in those kind of casual arrangements.
Right.
So the Act, it defines casual work as basically if you're getting paid daily and the tasks you're doing take less than 24 hours each.
Okay, so day-to-day short-term stuff. Got it.
Exactly. But here's where it gets interesting. There's this provision, Section 37, that basically says just because you start out as casual doesn't mean you stay that way forever.
You mean like there's a path to becoming more permanent even if you begin with a casual arrangement?
Exactly. If you're a casual worker and you end up working continuously for a certain amount of time.
How long are we talking? Well, it depends on the specific circumstances. But the point is, once you hit that threshold, the Act says, okay, now you're considered a regular employee.
Wow. That's a game changer.
Right. And not just in terms of how you're classified, but you also become eligible for all the same benefits as regular employees, like paid leave, sick leave, that kind of thing.
So it's like the law is recognizing that your employment status can evolve.
Exactly.
That's really cool. Okay, speaking of interesting legal tidbit, I found another one in here that I wanted to get your take on.
Oh, let's hear it. I love a good legal quirk.
Okay, so this one's about what happens when a job ends, whether you leave voluntarily or, things just don't work out.
Okay, I'm listening.
So in Kenya, even if you get fired, Your employer is still required to give you something called a certificate of service.
Right. Basically, it's a document that proves you worked there.
Exactly. And it seems like a pretty standard thing in a lot of places, but here's the part that threw me. This applies unless you work there for less than 4 weeks.
Ah, yes. Section 51, that little caveat.
Right. It's such a specific time frame. Like, what's so magical about 4 weeks? After 4 weeks, you get a certificate, but before that, you're out of luck. What do you make of that?
It is interesting, isn't it? And to be honest, the act itself doesn't really go into the reasoning behind that 4-week cutoff.
It's like a legal mystery for us to solve.
Yeah.
What changes after those 4 weeks that make that certificate so important?
It's hard to say for sure without digging deeper into the legislative history or, maybe looking at how this has been interpreted in court cases. But if I had to speculate,
Please do.
I'd say it likely comes down to balancing the administrative burden on employers, especially for those really short-term gigs, versus the benefit to the employee of having that proof of employment.
So maybe for very short-term jobs, they figured it wasn't worth the paperwork.
Possibly. But after 4 weeks, it seems like the thinking was, okay, now there's a greater chance that you might need to show this to a future employer, so we're going to make sure you have it.
Interesting. It's like after those 4 weeks, it's like the law is saying, okay, this job counts. It's part of your official work history.
Exactly.
It's fascinating how much thought goes into all these little details, isn't it?
It really is. And often it's these little details that can reveal a lot about a country's values and priorities.
It's like we've been on this incredible journey piecing together all these little clues to understand how employment works in Kenya.
I like that. It's like we're detectives of the legal world.
Exactly. But instead of solving a crime, we're uncovering all these fascinating insights into workers' rights.
And what I find really remarkable is how this act we've been exploring, it really does try to keep up with the times.
Oh, totally. It's not stuck in the past, that's for sure.
Right. It provides that crucial safety net, those minimum standards we talked about. But it also recognizes that not all work looks the same these days. Things are always changing.
Absolutely. So, as we wrap up our deep dive here, if you had to pick just a few key things for our listeners to remember about the Kenyan Employment Act, what would they be?
Ooh, that's a tough one. It's like picking a favorite child.
Hmm.
But I'd say first and foremost, remember, this act is designed to protect you, the worker. It's all about those minimum standards. No matter what, you're entitled to those basic rights.
Okay, minimum standards, check. What else?
Secondly, and this is something we touched on earlier, the act really tries to address the realities of different employment situations like casual work. It acknowledges that those arrangements can be a bit more fluid, and it provides protections for workers even if they're not in a traditional long-term contract.
Right. Casual work, check. Okay, give me one more for the road. What's our final takeaway for today?
Let's see, how about this? The Kenyan Employment Act shows just how seriously they take protecting vulnerable individuals. From banning those exploitative job offers to giving officials the power to combat child labor, it's clear that safeguarding those who are most at risk is a top priority.
Absolutely. It's been amazing to have you on this legal adventure with me today, breaking down all these important aspects of Kenyan employment law. I feel like we've only just scratched the surface, though.
Oh, there's always more to explore, but that's the beauty of it, right? It sparks that curiosity, that desire to keep learning and digging deeper.
Couldn't have said it better myself. Well, on that note, we'll leave our listeners with one final thought to ponder. As you've heard us discuss the ins and outs of this Kenyan law, we're curious. How do these protections compare to those in your own country? What similarities or differences stand out to you? Let us know. Until next time, keep exploring those fascinating legal landscapes.